Full Stop has been empowering me for, I think, the last 2-3 years. I first started reaching out to the phone hotline, and it was great to nearly instantly have someone to talk to at any time of the day who would listen to you, give you some advice if you ask for it, and just support you in the things you need. I also didn't feel stigmatized, and I felt like the people that I was talking to cared about me and wanted to support me. I think donating to a cause can be quite powerful, and donating to Full Stop leads to survivors getting supported, more phone lines being available, and hopefully one day all phone calls of people who experience violence can be attended to immediately.
Tara Hunter, good morning, Director of Client and Clinical Services at Full Stop Australia. Thank you very much for joining us at the Impact Leaders webinar. How are you this morning?
I'm very well, thanks. Thanks for having me along.
It's our pleasure. I mean, we really commit to these conversations because we want to bring to life the extraordinary work of our NGO partners. And indeed, I've been looking forward to this conversation because it's one that really touches on the heart of what we do as an organisation, which was started to mitigate and address the issues that impact women and girls. And of course, violence sadly remains one of those key human rights abuses in Australia and globally. Could you please start by just telling us what Full Stop Australia does?
So broadly, our mission is to put a full stop to sexual, domestic and family violence. But how we action that on a daily basis, we have really 3 pillars to our organisation. So we have 24/7 trauma specialist counselling services, mainly on phone, online, but we also have some face-to-face services across New South Wales. We have training and consultancy services, so we work with a whole range of government, non-government and corporate organisations across Australia around providing information support, particularly around responding to and preventing gender-based violence. And finally, the work that we do at the front line, working with victims, survivors and with organisations, informs advocacy at a whole range of levels, mainly with government, both federal and New South Wales and other state governments, in terms of advocating for change across our systems, improvement in our systems, and really bringing a voice to victim survivors.
What inspired you to work with Full Stop Australia specifically?
So I have been a social worker for over 25 years, and I was reflecting on, so yesterday was my 2-year anniversary at Full Stop Australia. And look, this organisation has really been part of my practice framework over the 25 years. It's always been one of those really steadfast referral options for clients that have been impacted mostly by sexual violence, but also we provide services for all people impacted by sexual, domestic and family violence. I think for me, it's again going back to the way in which we deliver services. We have a trauma specialist workforce. I'm always in awe of the experience of our counsellors. So I learned lots from them, and it's actually a real privilege to lead such a skilled clinical workforce. But also, I think it really strongly aligns with my values around, we have an intersectional feminist framework and our values around actually not being quiet and really challenging the status quo around some of our community attitudes, but also I see still, unfortunately, across our systems that people try and engage with health, police, where there is, there are often closed doors or people looking away when they are disclosing experiences of sexual, domestic and family violence. So I feel like I'm really well placed over my many years of experience to not only support and lead a workforce, but also more broadly have a voice in some of the systems that respond to people impacted by sexual, domestic and family violence.
If we just zoom back momentarily and perhaps look at the last 10 years, I started I Could Change because I wanted to create new and sustainable funding for organisations such as Full Stop Australia, working on the front lines to protect and mitigate and seek to end such high levels of violence against women. And I was shocked as a man and beginning to realise my privilege around not only how prevalent violence against women was, but how few men understood it and understood their role in it, even if it be as passive bystanders, the extent to which we must work upstream so that young boys who are almost always born as sweet little boys one day become perpetrators. What happens along the way? It's a far more complex conversation to begin to actually understand that we're all somehow responsible for turning sweet boys into violent perpetrators. What happens along that continuum, along that journey in our current societies where violence against women is normalized to such a high degree? Could you perhaps speak to what you're seeing in the prevention space in terms of looking to create wholesale change? I mean, I think you'd agree, ideally the services of Full Stop ideally don't need to exist one day. Sadly, it's probably not going to happen in our lifetime. But where do you see we've come, if anywhere, in a meaningful way in the last 10 years to actually starting to make a wholesale shift towards how men engage in this issue, how people are taking responsibility, perhaps even how far the policing services have come to addressing domestic and family violence? I know it's sort of a big question, but just sort of through your experience, it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, look, it is a big question and probably has some really complex layers in terms of answering that. And I will start with, we understand what the drivers of gender-based violence are, and really they have their foundations in gender inequality. And we're seeing more broadly work happen across this country, and it's slow, but there is the conversation starting around ensuring that we all have equality. Doesn't matter what gender we're born with and what gender we live in, but we should all be considered to be equal and to be humans. And unfortunately, as you talked about, we know that 97% of perpetrators of gender-based violence are men. Most often the people impacted by that violence are women and children. And that does come along with those inequalities and privilege that come with being a male. So part of our responsibility is more broadly, and I really, really like your concept around we all have a role to play here. We do. We do have a role to actually, we need to educate ourselves and we need to stand up and absolutely bring men along with us. And I think that's certainly been part of the conversation that I have witnessed over the last 10 years, is just trying not to be so siloed around, women responding. And we are mostly a female workforce. I have no issue with that, but we also have to engage men around part of those conversations to create change. I have seen, again, in the past 10 years, particularly in the past 5 years, I previously oversaw a sexual assault, frontline sexual assault service, around times where we have seen the Me Too movement. We are having much more of a public conversation about domestic and family violence and sexual violence. But also what we're seeing, certainly in a frontline perspective, is increases in violence, or increase in reports of domestic and family and sexual violence. So it's one of the few crimes that continues to increase. So we've got a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
It's great we're having the conversation, and I think we can't just look at prevention. We have to look at really resourcing an integrated response. And when I talk about integrated, it's not just about having counselling services. It's not just the responsibility of the police. We need to have accessible police services, but we need to have a justice system that's actually accessible and safe for victim survivors. And we do have a lot of work to do in that space as well. And we need resourcing for people to recover from trauma.
Yeah, I very much agree. It is, of course, a holistic response that's required. 1 in 3 women will experience physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. We know that statistic well. Almost 1 woman a week is killed in this country by a former or current partner. I mean, I tend to think the language is so critical. I imagine you'd agree, and I have always sort of advocated for the idea of calling it what it is. It's men's violence against women. I mean, when we're talking 97%, calling it family violence, I think dilutes the reality of what's happening on the ground. And you're seeing that at the front lines, the devastating effects and trauma that is caused by men in these circumstances. It's not to blame men, but there are, undoubtedly, statistically, a large minority of men in this country who are perpetrators, and they're actually not part of this conversation, right? I mean, I get frustrated. We go on marches and we advocate and we fund extraordinary organisations, and yet, the men who are largely the perpetrators are not, know it's wrong and it is a criminal act. But again, this is a bigger conversation, right? How do we, one of the programs we help fund is the Man Cave, where they're going in and they're working with young teenagers about redefining masculinity. And of course, there's a lot of work that is starting to be done in this space around what do healthy relationships look like? How can girls be respected, where we can, I think, sadly come from the foundation that it may not be modelled at home, is probably a safe bet. And so how can we teach young men, it's less about sporting prowess and all those subjects, which many of which, like maths, we may not ever use, but actually the key life skills around healthy relationships and gender equality and deep respect and connecting with girls as friends before seeing them as sexual objects. As you say, it all actually is underpinned by that gender imbalance ultimately, which there's interesting and good work starting to be done in this space. So just coming back to Full Stop itself, because I know one of the defining differences as an organisation is, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but you work with clinical psychologists or trauma-informed counsellors. Could you please just make a point about that, because that's actually a critical difference that is the foundation to your work, as I understand.
Yeah. So we have a staff of trauma, we call trauma specialist counsellors. So not just psychologists, but also social workers. All our counsellors that are on the phone line have a minimum of 3 years experience working in this space, and have, properly have a recognised qualifications in social work or psychology. I think the other bit is, and our clinical workforce is actually very stable. When I joined it, many of our clinicians have been here for years or more. One of the things around sustaining the kind of expertise that we have in this workforce is we also have, myself as a clinical director, but we also have 4 clinical leaders who provide 20, so we're a 24-hour service, we run on a shift roster basis, so we have to provide that support for our counsellors on the line, so that in order for us to sustain a level of expertise, but also a level of wellbeing for our workforce, we provide significant support and debriefing and consultation for our clinical staff. And I think the other bit that is different to a phone line like ours to some of the other phone lines is that when you connect to our service, you connect directly to a trauma specialist counsellor. So if you ring, I don't work on the phone lines, but if you rang and I was working on the phone line, I would be the only person that would speak to you. So regardless of whether you're ringing for a 5-minute, I just want some information about X, or whether you are ringing because you are making a first disclosure, and that's, you know, a longer counselling session, it doesn't matter. You will still speak to one person. I think the other bit for us around the service that we deliver is that we're not just a one-off counselling service. We're able to engage with people in a more ongoing way. I think we fill gaps. We know that there are significant waiting lists for sexual violence services across Australia that provide specialist support. And also what we find with domestic and family violence is that often when people are safe and when they're most ready to kind of move into that space where they might want some trauma specialist counselling, there is a limited pool of services there. So somewhere like our service is a really safe place to start. We can fill some gaps. We're also able to talk to people and not have their name, date of birth, exactly where they live. We can work with people over time to negotiate how you want to identify yourself, so you don't have to retell your story, but you don't have to give your full identifying details either.
Can you give us a sense of how often the phone rings each day?
So we pretty constantly. We provide, I'm just trying to think of my numbers, I think it was 16 or 17,000 occasions of service last year alone. And yeah, I think in the 2 years that I've been here, just witnessing again, just that small but steady increase in occasions of service as well.
It's extraordinary, isn't it?
Yeah, unfortunately, as you said, you would want us not to. We do want to put a stop to sexual, domestic, and family violence, but I don't think that we're going to be out of business in a hurry. No. Unfortunately, yeah.
So there's a number of organisations working on the front lines. That's one of the defining differences is that clinical training which your frontline team has. Is there anything else that makes Full Stop Australia unique in respect to its focus, its methodology, or its impact that you could share with us?
Well, there are lots of things. I think we have our foundations. You know, we're we actually started as a grassroots movement in the 70s in response to sexual violence. So we're very feminist-led.
You're one of the oldest, isn't that right?
Yes, absolutely.
In Australia.
Yes, yeah, and we have a very proud history in that feminist movement, but we also have what we call an intersectional approach to the work we do, and that is about understanding that people that experience sexual, domestic, and family violence often have other vulnerabilities, including things like living with a disability or from a culturally and linguistically diverse background where we know, or Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people, where there are a whole range of factors that mean that people in different communities might experience violence at an increased level. But we also know that they also experience barriers to accessing services. So, and we look at people with diverse sexualities and genders as well, and not always a recognition or an understanding of the context of the violence, the interpersonal violence that might happen in those communities as well. So we really pride ourselves on being victim survivor centred, meeting a person where they're at, regardless of what part of their journey they're in. So I think that they're some of the outstanding strengths of our organisation. I think the other thing I just wanted to talk about in terms of the services we deliver, we also provide services for frontline responders as well. So we're a space where, say for example, if you work for New South Wales Health, if you work on the front line in other organisations, and even corporate organisations which are increasingly responding to and dealing with people that it might be experiencing gender-based violence. We know, it's legislated that you have to, we provide domestic and family violence leave. So we're seeing across all sectors where people may be exposed to a disclosure of gender-based violence. And as a service, we provide debriefing and support to people that are providing services on those front lines as well. And we can provide that. We provide that in a fee-for-service way, but we also provide that an informal and safe way where some people, they don't feel safe necessarily disclosing that in their workplace, or putting their hand up and saying that they're struggling with the work that they're doing. And we also know that in workforces like ours that are that are mostly female, but often, we're a mission-driven organisation, and we have people that come to work for us because they have their own experiences and they want to make a difference. And part of that is working for an organisation like ours.
So given there's that, an uptick in the number of calls coming through, we're in a period that is challenging economically, which tends to put further stress on families, which can be a driver of additional family violence. What are the main, say over the past 12 months, the main challenges and opportunities for the organisation that you've been seeing moving forward?
Oh, look, you named it. Our challenge is, we have a number of government-funded services. I need to be really upfront about that. But we also made a decision this year, this financial year, to self-fund, philanthropically fund our national phone line, which was previously supported by another corporate partner. So one of the big things is around sustainability and actually having some certainty around our service delivery. And I think that flows through to staffing and ensuring that we are actually able to provide stable employment, again, to a very female workforce. And these are some of the subtleties that we see when we talk about gender inequalities and, frontline caring workforces that are often staffed by women, often are on the receiving end of either philanthropic grants or government grants that are short term. So that creates some uncertainty. So that, the short answer is resourcing is probably one of our key challenges. I think, as I said, the other bit is service demand. It keeps, that just slowly ticks away.
So how's the current climate then perhaps affecting the philanthropic funding?
I think that
for those frontline team.
Well, I think that generally it might, it may well impact on people's decisions around whether they're giving, bigger grants to organisations like ours. That's not to say that we don't have we do have some generous philanthropic partners, but I think we don't necessarily have certainty into the future. And as you say, when we're experiencing economic downturn, then obviously that impacts, and it might not impact this week, but it probably impacts this time next year in terms of sustainability. And also speaking to, and it's not a driver of gender-based violence, but certainly a facilitator when we see increased household stress around economic distress. We know also the context of domestic and family violence and sexual violence as well can really, there are a whole range of drivers around economic and financial abuse that can be part of those dynamics that are occurring.
Can I ask where your passion comes from for your work, for protecting and supporting women?
So I had to have a little bit of a reflection on this. I guess one of the things I will say, I don't see myself as protecting. I see myself absolutely enhancing and supporting women and all people affected and impacted by gender-based violence. I have been a social worker for 25 years, and one way or another, I have always ended up in a space where I have worked alongside women in different ways. And I guess some of that is always just feeling absolutely privileged and in awe of people that are experiencing things like domestic and family violence or sexual violence. And hearing stories where people can talk about their acts of resistance and their ability to recover and resilience. And I'm not saying that everyone needs to feel resilient, because often when they access services like us, they're feeling really quite distressed often. And so what a privilege to be able to work with people and provide that safety. And where the passion came from, I'm really not sure. I guess that it's
Your
something
humanity.
Yes, perhaps. But it's always, as I said, just, absolute awe and interest in hearing stories from other people about their lives and how they've made a difference for themselves. And I think, if I'm able to support people in a safe way to share those stories and absolutely support them with tools, in whether they're very practical tools or whether they're tools to actually manage the impacts of trauma, to maintain safety, then what a great job.
So could you share perhaps one unique challenge and one unique joy of your work? I'm sure
Look,
many,
I think
what would stand out?
there's a few. Look, I think the unique challenge, and I talked a little bit about our workforce, but I just, again, want to do a big shout out to our workforce. And one of the challenges is, maintaining and enhancing like a workforce that has the specialty, the specialised skills that sit within our organisation. And I think it's also about, I'm really passionate about not only us caring for our clients, but also making sure that our workforce is well, and that they're acknowledged and that they receive the right support in order to deliver services at a high level. So that's one of the things I think is always an ongoing challenge, is about maintaining workforces and attracting people with the right skills, and being able to, as I said, offer, some certainty around employment as well. So that's a challenge. The joys, I think I've talked about, just the privilege of bearing witness to people's stories, but also more broadly, I think in the role that I work in now is at a level where I also do, a broad amount of engagement, either as in education, on advisory panels. I do quite a lot of work in the media, and actually about hopefully giving a really respectful voice around the experience of victim survivors, and really strongly advocating for change. I do work with the New South Wales Police Force particularly around improving responses to things like sexual violence. And so I think that is one of my joys, is actually many, many years later, having the privilege to actually hopefully make some change in how we respond to and put an end to gender-based violence.
And as you said earlier, this takes funding.
It does.
To keep the organisation going. So from businesses giving back $1 at a time, I Could Change has been able to raise over $78,000 and counting for Full Stop Australia, which is wonderful, because we haven't been in partnership that long. We want to accelerate that funding for you. Can you just give a snapshot? I mean, listeners, as I understand, it's like, okay, it's not a small amount of money, it's not huge, but what sort of impact does that level of funding have for the work that Full Stop does? Could you give us a snapshot?
So really, I think, as I talked about in terms of, and that's where we've kind of make a choice around making sure that we're supporting our national line. As I said, we've made a decision to keep that going for the next couple of years, and seek ways in which we can have that service in a more sustainable way. So that's one of the things. It does support employment of trauma specialist counsellors, and some of the administration costs that go alongside that. So as you say, it doesn't keep the service, it doesn't pay for the service in whole, but it certainly goes a long way to supporting us to keep ticking along. I think the other thing I wanted to talk about is just actually having the presence in businesses. It also just very subtly starts the conversation and the awareness around, oh, what's Full Stop? What sort of work do we do? And I think that's some of the work that some of the things that you talked about, and obviously as part of your passion in having organisations like yours, where we actually are having a community-based conversation, so that it's not just, absolutely essential to have services like ours where we're a safe space, we're confidential. But I'm also really, one of the things I really try and challenge is actually othering this issue, because it's something that, given the numbers, most of us know someone that's impacted, or we know, some people are living with histories or current issues of sexual, domestic and family violence.
Yeah, and I think that's part of a bigger conversation we need to have, because as you say, businesses are now being mandated over a certain size to provide domestic and family violence leave, and so they should know more about your work. They should be further funding your work. There's a natural fit there. How further can I Could Change businesses help?
Well, I think it's just that continued, as you say, that ticking along and the more funding that we have, then we have the capacity to increase staffing, but also it's things where we can have opportunities. So we have a national survivor advocate program where we can run, we can also run discrete programs or projects around increasing access or awareness around our services. So I think it's about more broadly being able to not just about kind of ticking along, it's also just about looking at and being strategic for the future, as you say, how we can create better awareness of this issue. And again, shout out to a service like ours, where if you are someone in a workplace, you're an HR officer, and someone comes and talks to you about their experience of domestic and family violence, you can that person can call our service, and so can you. So we really, I guess, as I said, one of the things we work really hard at is meeting people where they're at, regardless of what point in the journey they're in. And I think that's absolutely essential, because disclosures don't just happen in those places where we think, more naturally, they go into a hospital or someone goes into a doctor, and that's where a lot of disclosures happen. But also they do happen in workplaces, and they do happen. We know most people actually in the first instance will tell a family member or friend about their experiences. So, it's on all of us to kind of know where to reach out and get support.
And I think there's a strong argument, there's a duty of care, especially for some of the biggest employers in this country, to not only provide that support for their employees, but actually provide the support to organisations such as Full Stop, which is strengthening communities from the outside in, or the inside out, depending on the perspective. And of course, we can't have thriving communities and economies without the full inclusion of women. We know that globally. And when women are experiencing any form of abuse or violence, it obviously holds them back from fulfilling their potential in all aspects of life. And so there is a broader commitment there, which, of course, we'd all love to see that sort of legislated, that there is a 1%, for example, of profit, distribution required to the best frontline services in Australia to ensure women can be at their best and can be supported. We've got a long way to go in this conversation, and of course we've come arguably a long way as a country, even in the last 10 years. But given the figures that we've heard from you today, it's still a devastating issue for women in this country. What keeps you going? I mean, you hear so many stories. Just briefly, what keeps you going, and what do you perhaps most look forward to each day?
What keeps me going? I think, again, just that sense of, I can't say that ever walk in the door to Full Stop Australia and have a day where it's just run of the mill. I'm surrounded by, amazing professionals, not just clinical staff, but also the operational staff at Full Stop Australia. So I think that stuff around being in an organisation where we're on a mission, literally, we're all on a mission. We have that shared vision around really being committed to providing really safe services, but also more broadly advocating for change. So I think that's one of the things that keeps me going. I think it's also, a really supportive workforce. So it's really important to work in a space like ours, where you are dealing with traumatic material one way or another. Every day is to be coming to a space where it is safe. And what keeps me going? I don't know.
I think you've answered it. Doing all the above.
Yes, something like that. Yeah.
Doing the incredible work. No, and of course, to acknowledge this work needs funding. We're a very proud partner of Full Stop Australia. And for anyone listening who works for a business or owns a business, this is an incredible organisation you can support through I Equal Change. We have the tech to make it simple, to enable you to give back from every sale. You can give a certain amount, you can cap it, you can run campaigns where actually you double your donation without discounting. There's all sorts of ways in which you can talk to your purpose now as an organisation, beyond just your product and beyond promotion. What we're seeing, which is exciting, is how Australians as consumers are really stepping up and backing those businesses that are giving, backing those businesses that tell a bigger story, backing those businesses to give back, that are committed to having that broader purpose beyond just their product alone. And so leading into the season for giving, arguably Christmas is what it's meant to be. This is a wonderful organisation you can support, come on board, see the impact it has on the organisation, on your customers and on your internal teams. You know, we're seeing how much teams and staff want to work for businesses that are committed to giving back and supporting life-changing organisations like Full Stop Australia. I know we have one question that's come in from Instagram. What role does education play in preventing sexual assault, and how can we promote age-appropriate education on this issue? Tara, what would you say about that?
Oh, look, I think it's essential, and I actually acknowledge you talked about prevention, and I didn't address the issue of, look, age appropriate, and we need to talk about the issue around consent, around gender equality, around respectful relationships from the start, from the start of when we are parenting children from early childhood in schools and the community setting. But schools obviously are a really great place to have age-appropriate education, and it doesn't need to be necessarily talking about sex, but more broadly it can be. And so we actually, as a country, we really need to level up and be really open to having some hard conversations, but also open conversations. So if we're open, we know secrecy breeds, particularly when we talk about child sexual abuse, secrecy breeds child sexual abuse. Let's put it out in the open. Let's be, create safe and respectful relationships and opportunities for our children and young people. I think it's really essential part of creating change, because that's when we look at the prevalence of sexual violence in our country, it is mostly impacting children and young people. And as you talked about, Jeremy, you talked about how gender-based violence can actually impact on people's engagement in work, engagement in education. So it's really important that we prevent this happening in the first place, but also have, if people do experience services, they need violence, that they need responsive services, because that in itself can be another intervention around creating safety in the future.
Thank you for that question, a really important one and an important response. We're getting close to time. One final question from me, Tara. In many years from now, when you look back on your life, what do you believe you'll be most proud of?
I have to say, I've got 2 children, so hopefully, I have to give them. I have to give them a big shout out. So I think that's part of it. But obviously, feeling really reflecting on the work that I have done, and what an amazing journey so far. But also, particularly in the last 5 or so years, I am seeing change. I am seeing, the fact that we're meeting today and having this conversation, and organisations like yours exist to promote the issue of sexual violence, domestic and family violence more broadly, that we are able to actually start having these conversations. So I feel hopeful that I will look back and say, that was part of when things started to shift.
And we'd like to ask that question because part of what we seek to achieve in these conversations is to demystify the nature of the work that NGOs and not-for-profits do, and highlight the extraordinary people, the brilliant minds and passionate individuals who are working on these issues. They're not there for the money. They're there to, as you are, really make a dent in the universe on what is one of the most intractable and ancient human rights abuses of our time, which is violence against women and girls. Tara Hunter, thank you so much for your time. Director of Client and Clinical Services at Full Stop Australia. We really appreciate you joining us and giving us a deeper dive into the amazing work you do as one of the oldest organisations in Australia that is working on the front lines to support women at very much their hours of need. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your wisdom and insights and expertise with us today.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me along. And also just, a big shout out to all the people out there that are supporting our organisation either now or hopefully into the future. And I think we can't thank you enough, because it's that kind of engagement that keeps our organisation running.
Thank you.